College football nerds here doing our preseason top 10. That's right, y'all like to say how you hate preseason rankings, but then you talk about them all the time. So we're going to do one, and the way we're doing these, Josh and I just spent a lot of time, more than normal, talking through our preseason ranking. And what it is for us is if we were fielding a team, these are the 10 teams we'd least like to play in that order. And that's how we bounced off, like when we were discussing, would you rather play Iowa State or Florida? You don't have to answer that. It was rhetorical. But that's what we did. So it's not really how AP does it. It's not how many voters do it. And we will shuffle dramatically based on week one results. Even in wins, we're going to drop people if they don't look good. That's how we do it. We care more about how you play, not necessarily how clean your record is. All right, so 2 pieces of homework for y'all. One in the comments. Give us your top 10. We'd love to talk about it, and that's why the comment section is there. Number 2, we are doing a live show. It's a new thing for us, a live show Saturday night, September 4th. So opening weekend of football, we're going to be talking live with y'all about what we saw that day during the night, and maybe real-time discussions about some late games too. So keep an eye out for us, posting that. Finally, because you're going to ask, this is Clyde Mays Alabama whiskey. They say it's Alabama whiskey. It's actually not made in Alabama. And you're thinking, oh, now we know who you're a fan of, where you live, all that stuff, but they have distribution all over the country. So I actually think it's made in Florida. All right, Josh, let's go 10-1. Going to reveal number 1 at the very end, big reveal. So give me your number 10, and I'll give you mine.
My number 10 is a team I took a lot of heat for not including in my way too early top 10, and that's Iowa State. So when we were having a discussion on what team I'd least like to play, the truth is, everyone from 7 on is really hard. And if you want to tell us X team doesn't deserve to be there, you need to tell us however many teams need to be in front of them, because it's really, really hard to say who anyone is really outside, I would say, the top 6 nationally. And Iowa State has a lot of all Big 12, Big 10, Big 8, however many teams are left, performers in that squad. And, I mean, solid defense, good proven quarterback, really good offensive line play, a lot of pieces that I just don't know how many teams have. And my expectation, frankly, is that Iowa State will not end up being a top 10. But as of right now, there's just a lot more good pieces. Great running back. We're super high on him. And, that's why I have them number 10.
I love Breece Hall. I'm not high on Purdy. Which is, I know, sacrilegious to say for our friend Josh Pate, who is an Iowa State fan, so he says, and he'll probably give me hell about it. But I love Breece Hall. I think he should be a Heisman candidate. But Brock Purdy, even in that blowout against Oregon, 5.6 yards per attempt, which is woof. I've got Florida at number 10. When we're talking about teams that lost a lot of talent, it's going to be Florida. Like, offensively, they're turning over entire unit. But we also talk about coaches who can scheme their way to 30 points, and that's Dan Mullen. He doesn't recruit really well, hasn't run the ball really well in any of his teams lately, but he's just going to find 30 points where he needs it. And to me, that's scary if I'm playing him and I don't have an Alabama or an Oklahoma. So that's who I've got at number 10. Give me your number 9.
My number 9 is Oregon, the team that, ironically, Iowa State just beat up pretty bad. But I think the whole Pac-12 was at a massive disadvantage, having only played half a season. And I think we're going to see a big step forward from them this year. And I really feel like Oregon is growing to be a superpower on the West Coast. And I'm not sure if they do take that step forward this year. But at this point, I feel like they're the most likely to, more than USC. So that's why I have Oregon number 9.
I have Oregon number 9 as well. I don't have Iowa State in my top 10. I think that, again, they might end up in the top 10. They might have a clean record and be, I'm not super high on the Big 12 this year, so they might be the second best team in the Big 12 again. But I don't have them in my top 10 because I don't
And
think.
that was a weird game too. I mean, you noted that beforehand. It's easy to say, well, Iowa State just blew out Oregon. I don't think a lot of people understand how that game went and what the statistics were. Iowa State did not dominate Oregon, even though they played twice as many games when they went into it.
Yeah, and that's the point you made in our way too early is that Iowa State was in well-oiled machine end of season form, and Oregon just had a few games under the belt, so it's a little different. It's not a fair comparison, but they did win that one fair and square. All right, so number 8, I'll go first. I have North Carolina, and this is a team that neither one of us are super high on because they're kind of the like dark horse, sexy pick. Great offense. They're turning over their entire wide receiver unit, which scares me a little bit, and running back room. I worry about North Carolina because this is a team that could have beaten Clemson last year if they played them, potentially, but also lost to Florida State and got kind of manhandled by Notre Dame. That's what scares me about North Carolina when we're thinking about them as a top 10 team. But I also think that, everybody's talking about Rattler being the Heisman dark horse. I think right now he'd be third, in my opinion, behind Howell and DJU at Clemson. And if I'm drafting a quarterback this year, based on what I've seen, it's Sam Howell for me. So North Carolina, number 8. Give me yours.
My number 8 is also North Carolina. I agree with you. This pick scares me maybe more than any other in the top 10. If you look at all three tiers of all ACC teams, there are not a ton of North Carolina players on those lists. It's a lot of faith in the recruiting that Mac Brown's done and the program he's built. But, I mean, I'll tell you, that was a crazy amount of talent that was lost. Multiple NFL, maybe future NFL starters. And I will forever believe Phil Longo, knowing his style of offense, is always going to be boom or bust. It was when he was in the SEC, it was the most volatile offense in the conference. And it will have games where they blow people up and everyone gets really high on them. And then they will turn around and have their, baffling losses to Virginia and Florida State. So, yeah, I have them at number 8. Don't have a lot of confidence. And I'll say, I'm curious if you agree with this. If you made me pick who was the most likely to be the second best team in the ACC, North Carolina or the Field, I would probably take the Field. But they're the most likely of the group. But I think it's more likely that they don't end up the second best in the conference than that they do.
Yeah, I was on a work trip this past week talking to a North Carolina fan. Shout out to Brian, who said, "I'm scared because we're going to start out like 8-0 and lose to Georgia Tech," and that's a fear that North Carolina fans have, but it's real. I told him that's not going to happen this year, but who knows? So number 7 for me, I have Penn State, and this is one where I'm really kind of out of track with the AP. This is me maybe gambling or being optimistic in the notion that 2020 was just a COVID weirdness year for Penn State. They returned an absolute wealth of talent on both sides of the ball. My only concern is I don't love Sean Clifford at quarterback. So number 7 for me at Penn State is they're greater than the sum of their parts. I think they're going to get a little bit overhyped if they win that Wisconsin game because they're also going to beat an SEC team in Auburn, who we are not high on this year. Auburn does not have a lot of talent on that roster. Penn State might win that game pretty big. It's a huge game, at Beaver Stadium. If they win against Wisconsin after beating Auburn in, I think, week 3, they're going to have so much hype behind them, and they're going to be kind of overrated. So I think that I'm a little scared that they might, rat poison kind of thing. But I think if I'm thinking about teams that I don't want to play, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt that 2020 was just a weird year. Parsons kind of left them in a lurch. But who knows? I could be wrong. Give me your number 7.
My number 7 is Indiana, and that's a team that's returning a tremendous number of starters, 8 on offense, 9 on defense. One of the best things I like to see, which is you've got former defensive starters that are now listed as backups. That is usually the hallmark of a team that's going to improve significantly. A lot of it hinges on how healthy Penix really is this year. Even if he's playing, does he have the same mobility? But they're building something there, and again, they're not a lot of proven teams 7 and beyond. One thing I'll say, if you talk about the seventh best team or afterwards, and you can make all kinds of arguments, Cincinnati, you can make an argument for Wisconsin, Florida, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's extremely difficult to project this year after last year, and I want to really reiterate something that we're going to say a lot early in the season. Stop talking about what happened in 2020 relative to 2021. That year had so many strange variables, I don't think it's going to have much of any bearing. And that scares me in regard to Indiana, because I think we may be kind of overreacting to the fact that Indiana last year played reasonably well, won some games early, and then faded when Phoenix lost. And I'm not sure that wasn't just a team that kind of had everything together early in the year, and then late in the year, when they played, even in their wins against Wisconsin and Maryland, they didn't look great. That may be more of who Indiana is, and this may be grossly overranking them, but given the options available, that's why I have them 7.
Yeah, and we saw without Penix last year, they lost to an Ole Miss team that was actually fairly depleted in that bowl game. So that's my concern, is what you just said, is that maybe it was a COVID flash for Indiana, though I'm super high on Allen, their head coach. I think he's an awesome coach, super underrated, and probably should have been picked up by an Auburn. I don't have them in my top 10, but they do return a lot of talent. I'm concerned. I'm always concerned about quarterbacks in their first year after an ACL. I don't think that it's something you can't come back from, but I think that first year as a skill player, especially if you rely on your wheels, if you're a pocket passer, if you're Tom Brady coming back off of that, that's fine. But if you're a guy that relies on 50% of your game is running the ball, that scares me a little bit. Number 6 is going to upset some people for me, but that's what I do. I've got Georgia at number 6, and I feel like there's this groundswell of support for Georgia as being, a top team this year, in that, we always talk about the elite teams. Then the next tier, there's a pretty considerable drop off, and Georgia's been in that next tier for the most part under Kirby Smart. And I think there's a lot of people that think, especially Georgia fans, that they're in that top tier. And this is a place where I'm admitting that I might be completely wrong, and they might prove me completely wrong. But I'm still not sold on JT Daniels being enough of a quarterback to put them in that elite plus status. So I've got them at number 6. Give me your number 6.
My number 6 is Texas A&M. I think Texas A&M is a team that a lot of people are talking about being high on, and I think a lot of people don't understand why. The quarterback position's unsettled, but neither one of us was high on Mond. But what they've got back is great pieces in terms of a physical team. They've got a tremendous amount of talent that they've recruited on the defensive side of the ball, which is starting to show up. And I think one of the more underrated points is they lost a ton of receivers to injury and opt-out prior or very beginning of last year, and they really weren't the same team down the stretch as a result. I mean, they lost kind of the last piece of that on the Florida game, and I don't think people realized how gutted they were at receiver. They've got kind of all those guys back. So on paper, there's a pretty good argument that Texas A&M is going to be a better team than they were last year when they were a top 5 team. And again, a lot of that hinges on the quarterback position, but Texas A&M for me is number 6, and I'll say number 6 to number 1 is a big gap from number 7 to number 10. The top 6 teams I think are considerably better than anyone 7 or after in my mind.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like I think for me, 6 to 1. So between Penn State and Georgia, I would far more rather play Penn State than Georgia. Like there's a huge gap there in my opinion. So I think that's a good way to put it. I've got Texas A&M at number 5. For all the reasons that you just said, I have them ahead of Georgia. I think today, if Texas A&M played Georgia, I would probably pick Texas A&M. A lot of that is me banking on, and we're doing a lot of this because it's preseason, banking on things that are unknown. A lot of that is me banking on the fact that you and I weren't high on Mond for 4 years. So I don't think that they're going to have that big of a step back. And where Florida's not recruiting great, so they're not reloading at these positions where they have massive turnover, Texas A&M has recruited great, and they're backfilling with returning talent. And that was a good, not elite Texas A&M team last year, not a playoff team last year, but a good enough team to win by multiple scores against North Carolina at the end of the season. So I've got Texas A&M number 5. I feel pretty good about that. Give me your number 5.
My number 5 flips with yours, and again, I'm sure at this point, as somebody's going to be mad no matter what we do, because these top 6 teams.
That's
all
what
have
we do, though,
arguments.
is make people mad.
Well, all of these top 6 teams, frankly, have an argument for being number 1, an argument of some sort. It's Georgia for me, and here's my deal with Georgia. If they had Eric Gilbert, if they had George Pickens, if they had a healthy Darnell Washington, if they had a healthy Tyke Smith, they'd be higher on this list. They're beat up. And going into that Clemson game, and I don't say this is necessarily dispositive, and don't think it is, but those are huge losses for Georgia, and it really changes the complexion of the team, not just for one game, but probably for a lot of the season. What should have been a strength in terms of, for the first time, having a really complete receiving core is no longer there, and the defense has, arguably something like 4 returning starters. I mean, it's a real rebuilding year from a defense that I didn't think the second string was phenomenal last year. So I think Georgia's in a considerably worse position than I had anticipated. And a lot of the talk I've heard from camp is that JT Daniels hasn't looked fantastic. And I think that's because not really Daniels. I think it's the receiving core is, like Burton's been out a lot. Jackson's been out. I may be wrong on one of these because there's so much to keep track of in preseason. But, I think Georgia should have been higher even on this list than they are, and they're kind of hampered by injury.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how much different this Georgia offense looks, or this Georgia team in general looks, based on what's happened since even camp started. And yes, they recruit at a level that they can kind of reload, and they do have talent behind them. But when we're talking about top 5 teams, we're talking about like an Ohio State or a Clemson. So like if Georgia loses a lot of key pieces because of injury or whatever, Pickens isn't there, you can't lose one of those pieces without it impacting you against a Clemson. So that's the bar that you have to meet. So for me, number 4 is Ohio State. And I know when we talk about teams and have that bar that we mentioned to reach, we've often said Alabama and Ohio State together, as like 1 and 2 is like, if you're going to be an Alabama or an Ohio State, that sort of thing. But now I've got them at 4, and I'm going to kind of spoil yours. You have them at 4 too, because I want you to talk about kind of why we both feel like they're not number 2, seeing as they were just in the championship game. So why don't you kind of handle number 4, Ohio State, for us together, while they're not number 1 or number 2?
I think Ohio State is set up to be a really good team this year. They've got good pieces at almost every position in the field. I'm not sure they're the powerhouse they have been. I mean, Olave and Wilson are a good receiving duo. They've got, I don't know how many people really fully realize just how freakishly deep that receiving core is at Ohio State. I mean, it's a little bit like where Alabama was a few years ago in terms of just depth. But I don't look at this roster and see a ton of massive impact guys. And you win games at this level by having massive impact players. And the teams in front of them have those guys at multiple positions. I think it's a good thing that Stroud's taken sort of that team by the reins and running with it. I don't think Stroud is going to be Fields. I just don't. I don't think he's as good a player. And Fields was an elite player. I don't know that Stroud is going to be that guy, and he's certainly not now. And given the turnover just all throughout the roster, I just don't think it's the same squad, and I don't know that it's going to be, as productive, especially given that they had some issues like defensive issues last year, and those aren't going to be necessarily wholly solved. So it's saying a lot that you're number 4 and number ahead of Georgia, ahead of Texas A&M, but I just don't think they have quite the firepower that the 3 teams we're going to both have ranked ahead of them have.
Yeah, and one of those teams at number 3 for me is Clemson. I think that I think that Clemson is going to be so much better than what they showed in that semifinal game last year. And a lot of that is returning a lot of key pieces on defense and having a Justin Ross and having a quarterback. Like, it's such a wealth and comfortable position to be in that you lose the number 1 overall draft pick and you have a quarterback that, in my opinion, for the college game is better than the guy that's leaving. And that's ridiculous to say, I understand, but you and I had our criticisms for 3 years with Trevor Lawrence and how he matched up against elite defenses. And I think DJ just offers some things that Lawrence didn't, frankly. And I think that this team is going to be overall more experienced and more something, kind of an intangible, that's got them really scary. And for me, 1, 2, and 3 is in a kind of a cluster by itself. And then there's a little drop off to Ohio State that's in that same kind of group with Georgia and Texas A&M for me. Give me your number 3.
It's also Clemson for the same reasons. Clemson's receiving core is going to benefit a lot, I think, from getting Justin Ross back. I think that's a huge deal. It's should have been one of the better players last year. And I don't know why we haven't heard more about him. He had a neck injury. I haven't heard anything to indicate that he's slower or any, less capable this year than he was in years past, but he's been fully cleared. And then they've got, like Nagata, Ladson, they've got a lot of high-level players that they got hurt last year and didn't contribute as much as were expected. My biggest concern with Clemson is really, I think ETN was probably the best player on that team in terms of just best college player last year and maybe even for the past few years. To me, he was Doug Martin to Kellen Moore at Boise State. I've often made the point, and I made it then, not that anyone's recording, but I always felt like Doug Martin was the key to Boise State. And obviously he had a long pro career, and Kellen Moore didn't necessarily have such a stellar one. I mean, he had a good pro career, but not a stellar one like Martin did. And ETN, and it's a shame that guy got hurt because this isn't going to be able to be verified. I think he was phenomenal. And I think that's a huge blow to Clemson in their consistency. And then defensive side of the ball, they just weren't very good in the back seven. They return a ton of those guys, but it was a lot of talent limitations. You lose Kendrick to transfer. And so you've got a lot riding on Murphy and Bresci. Maybe Xavier Thomas steps up. And then you've got maybe experienced solid guys in the back end. But those experienced solid guys got really exposed in the playoffs last year, and I have no real indication of why that won't happen again if they have to match up athletically. And so that's why, to me, Clemson's number 3 behind what is clearly Oklahoma and Alabama. So what is your order for Oklahoma and Alabama 1 and 2?
So we have them flipped. I have Alabama 2, Oklahoma 1, and you have Alabama 1, Oklahoma 2. And I'll give my defense and you can give yours. I think that if these two teams played today, I would favor Oklahoma because I saw a lot in their defense down the stretch. I'm still not sold that it's an elite defense. And I think Alabama's defense, for the first time in this really new era of Alabama having a RPO spread type of really basketball and grass kind of offense, Alabama having a really good defense. It's going to be deep. It's going to be as good as that 2016 unit, I think. Maybe give up a few more points because of how the game has changed a little bit. That defense is going to be awesome. But there are question marks around Bryce Young. When we saw him last year, it wasn't great. We're kind of being expected to assume that he is going to just take the next natural progression from who he was in high school. And you and I don't do that. Like, we don't really do that with incoming freshmen. We take a lot of heat because we don't assume depth because you have a highly ranked 5-star at a certain position. Georgia fans in particular give us a hard time for that. And Bryce Young, I'm not saying he's not all that. I'm saying we haven't seen it yet. And we have seen Rattler at Oklahoma be really, really, really good. And we know that wide receiving core is legit. So for that reason, right now, who would I rather play? I'd probably rather play Alabama because we've said in the past that 2018 Oklahoma offense, you pair it with a competent defense, which Oklahoma has now, and they're world beaters. They're scary. So that's why I've got Alabama 2 instead of 1. But now you're up. Let me know.
So first off, you can talk about why these two teams are great, and you can talk about where they have potential issues. And every college football team has major flaws. That's the nature of college football. I think Alabama has fewer flaws. There are a couple things that have sort of modified my opinion. One is Stevenson looks like a hoss in the pros in the preseason. And I'm thinking I maybe did just straight up miss him. I thought maybe he'd be too slow. Maybe he will be if he's playing starters. But he's looked really good. And I think Perkins is, the reports on him have been he was in pretty good. And at the same time, I'm also increasingly suspicious that Oklahoma playing Florida in the bowl game has just gotten too much credit, right? Like, we look at 55-20 over Florida. We don't look at 27-21 over Iowa State, or the earlier Iowa State loss, right? They played them twice, and they were close both times. So if we're talking about not having Iowa State in our top 10, how do we really justify having Oklahoma number 1 or number 2 when they were apparently evenly matched teams last year? Or at least in playing them twice, they certainly looked that way. I have real concerns about Oklahoma in the way I've evaluated them, and I'm going to kind of be curious to see if they can prove that we're not just way overreacting to what may have been a Florida team that had 3 days of practice, missed, I think there were 8 defensive starters. The entire receiving core I know was out, playing third string guys at linebacker, like true freshmen that have never played before in practice, like 2 days. And so I think they're really, really good, but man, we've got them in high level competition here with Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State, and you got to be really, really good. And we may be overreacting, especially given, like you said, Bryce Young. Now, we got to see him play some last year, and I've tried to watch the spring games of all these top teams, and he looked really good, but Rattler wasn't consistent. And when I look across the field at Alabama, I see the best linebacking core in college football. I see maybe multiple first-rounders on the defense. I see a quarterback that I think is at least maybe going to be as consistent as Rattler was, an incredibly deep stable of running backs, an incredibly talented offensive line, talented but unproven receivers. There's really no weak spot on Alabama's roster. There's unproven but not really weak. So it's hard for me to pick against Alabama at number 1, and especially given what I've heard from the spring and what I've tried to read up on people's reaction to camps. It sounds like Alabama looks better than people really anticipated, and that's why I have them number 1.
All right, y'all, that's it for us. That's our top 10. Give us your top 10 in the comments, and we're going to be releasing previews throughout the week preceding week 1 and during week 1. And also remember, Saturday night live show so we can mix it up with y'all. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.